The word now is the word atah. In fact, a couple of you pointed this out to me last week. It's interesting how often the word now comes into this passage. Then, now. And the idea of now really locates you in three different places temporally, or reminds you of three different places. When you think of now, where you're at now, what you perceive now, what's going on in your mind now, it drives you to think of two other time frames. And that's what he's doing. He's looking back. Notice where you are now, what you see now, and how does that relate to what you've seen before. So there's the now and then there's the past. Now, later on in this message, he's going to compare the now with the future. And he's going to make an astounding claim at the end of this message about what that future is going to look like. But he is focusing on their present perception, what you see now. And I think this does tie in with the perception that the people saw in Ezra chapter 3 as well. They looked at this, they perceived it, they perceived their own smallness in what they saw, the temple foundation being laid. These people, as they look at the largeness of the task before them, they're concerned about. They see in it a reflection of their own inadequacy. What I think is interesting is God does not judge the people for their perceptions. He's not saying, you're wrong to perceive things this way. You know, when we get a little troubled about the direction of our country, when we get concerned about what we see, family issues or interpersonal issues, God doesn't chastise us for saying, oh, you're wrong to see those things that way. I think the problem is dwelling on those perceptions and not seeing a broader vision of those perceptions. Not understanding the bigger picture of those perceptions, but wallowing in the smaller perceptions. And I think that's what's going on here. That's why he focuses on what you see. What do you see now? How does it look to you now? In fact, in verse 3, it's very interesting. In verse 3, he actually uses the phrase, in your eyes. How does this look in your eyes? Focusing on the issue of perception. He doesn't judge them for that. He doesn't say your perception is wrong. The focus seems to be that their perception is all they see. They don't see something bigger and grander to what they are doing than what they see in front of them. And that tends to be what we do, isn't it? We're so enveloped in our circumstances that we're not seeing the broader picture. We as Christians are people of a big picture. We may have a very little part in it, but we are people that are connected into a much larger picture of God's redemptive plan that he explains throughout Scripture, and his ultimate goal of glorifying himself and allowing us to participate in that eternally. And that perspective needs to trump any little perspectives that we have about our own inadequacy, about our own difficulties, about the things that we're struggling with right now. In fact, the perspective of our own lives can be helpful. Look back where you were. This is past. Look back where you were 20 years ago. Look where God has brought you. Consider what God can do with you in the future. But you can't balance those perspectives or the big picture perspective if all we see is the now. I do that too, by the way. You get in the busyness of the season, the happy holidays, and you know, all you can see is I got to go to this thing, I've got to finish this project, I've got to get this done. And you get very locked into your own little circumstances. They do not perceive the power of the unseen God in the things that God is calling them to do. They do not see the bigger picture of God's glorification, of God's honoring, of seeing in our circumstances opportunities to please and worship him. They only see their own smallness in their current situation. God understands our perceptions and he knows what we're going through. And I think we're going to talk about what to do with those perceptions, but I think it's fascinating that God has already, twice in Haggai, already said, listen, I know what you're thinking. I know what you're going through. And we tend to have this idea that God is just up there and being worshipped by angels, and he has no clue what we're struggling with. How could he possibly know? I know God knows all things. I know that as a theological category, as an attribute of God's abilities, but how could he possibly understand what I am going through? And I think it's fascinating here, twice in Haggai, he's appealed exactly to that. I know what you're thinking. Okay, you're thinking, oh, the time for building the house of the Lord is not, they'll come later. He says, I know you're thinking that. He gets into their brain and says, I know you're looking at your project and saying, boy, this is small. This is tiny. This is like nothing. So the fact that God knows what we're going through is tremendous. I want to share something it's a little theological issue. I don't think I'm ever going to solve this side of glory, but I'll share it with you. Christ has an enhanced ability to sympathize with the human experience post-incarnation. Okay? After the incarnation, and I'll just read Hebrews 4:15, and I'll let you chew on it on your own. Hebrews 4:15, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, and yet without sin. Okay, so the author of Hebrews several times draws our attention to the fact that post-incarnation, Christ has this heightened ability to sympathize with us. You'll be fascinated to know that the word sympathize is the word in Greek, sympatheo. It's the same word, sympathize, to sympathize. Does that mean, so this is my theological conundrum, that I don't know if I understand. Did God grow in knowledge after the incarnation? No, he didn't, because he knows all things. And yet somehow, the second person of the Trinity, I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it, has a heightened capacity to sympathize with you and me, because he has taken flesh upon himself. He has walked through the mire and muck of this world, because he suffered and died for our sake, experienced death and rose again. And that resurrection verifies that he can rise above the difficulties of this world, because he is God, because of the power of who he is. So he can sympathize in a unique way with us. Whenever you get to thinking, boy, God just does not know what I'm going through, I would tend to switch that around. Read the end of the Gospels, and you'll say, wow, I can't believe what he uniquely went through to save believers. And I think it'll put our own perceptions of our difficulties, of our smallness, of our struggles in a little bit of perspective. So that is that's the perception of the people. God acknowledges the perception of the people, and he wants to move them beyond that. Notice what he says, the motivation then for getting beyond the perception in verses 4 and 5. But now, take courage, Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Take courage also, Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the son of the high priest, and all you people of the land, take courage, declares the Lord, and work, for I am with you, declares the Lord. Verse 5. As for the promise which I have made to you, when you came out of Egypt, my spirit is abiding in your midst. Do not fear. So I think he gets to the heart of the problem and says, yes, the perception issue is a problem, but underneath there's the issue of fear. Underneath there is the issue of a lack of obedience, of a wrong priorities, as is addressed in chapter 1. And ultimately there is a problem of you're just not doing what you need to be doing. And he addresses that in these verses. It's very interesting again he says in chapter 2, verse 4, but now. So remember, he's just acknowledged their now perception. And they're looking back and saying, man, it was really nice then. And they're looking around them now and thinking, boy, we're facing a lot of opposition. You remember, we read it in Ezra chapters 4, 5, and 6, all the opposition that they were facing. And he says, well, we're facing all this opposition, and that's all they can see now. But he says, and now you need to rise above those present circumstances and be strong. And now you need to understand, I understand there's legitimate opposition. There's legitimate things that are out there, but you need to rise above those and do what you're supposed to do, empowered by the presence of God and putting God's priorities above our own. And he repeats this 3 times. Take courage, Zerubbabel. He says, take courage, Joshua, and all you people of the land, take courage. There's a threefold exhortation in verse 4 to take courage and to do and to act, to rise above the circumstances and to act. And I just thought it was interesting. It seems to me that courage needs to permeate the community from top to bottom. The leaders need to be courageous and do what they're supposed to do. The people need to be courageous and do what they're supposed to do. It isn't just the leaders dragging the people along. It isn't just the people pushing the leaders along. Everybody needs to be courageous and do what God has set in front of them to do. That need to be courageous, to rise above circumstances, to do what the Lord of hosts, has called us to do, needs to permeate the community. And I kind of got to thinking, it's interesting, this threefold exhortation. Take courage, take courage, take courage. Often when you find something repeated 3 times in Scripture, it's bringing emphasis to it. It's pointing out a significant issue or a problem. You need to do this. I just thought of a couple of examples of this. 1 Samuel 3:8, the Lord calls Samuel again for the third. Actually, I just put in the words third time. I was curious. What else has happened 3 times? The Lord calls Samuel again for the third time. The first 2 times, what happens? He thinks it's Eli. He goes in and, Eli, what can I, why are you calling me? And Eli says, I'm not calling you, man. I'm trying to sleep. Go away, kid, you're bothering me. This kind of the sense you get from the text. That third time, another time he comes in, and Eli understands that it is the Lord calling Samuel. That third time, Eli gets it. Okay, there's something going on here that's significant. And then God calls, actually, Samuel a 4th time, and Samuel acknowledges that it is from the Lord. And he says, here I am, Lord. What do you want me to do? Another interesting third time, by the way, 1 Kings 18:34. This is, one preacher referred to, this is when Elijah is dealing with the prophets of Baal. I loved hearing a sermon about this at Dallas Theological Seminary during one of the chapel. And one preacher called it Showdown at Shechem. I like that. There's a showdown at Shechem. There is one prophet of the Lord and all kinds of prophets of Baal. And it's really a fantastic passage, but it's interesting what it says in verse 34. Elijah says, fill the pitchers with water and pour down the burnt offering and wood. And then he said, do it a second time, and they did it a second time. How is fire going to come down from heaven and light this thing on fire if it's soaked? They think he's crazy. And he says, do it a second time. And do it a second time. He says, do it a third time. I don't want anyone walking away from here questioning in their mind who's in charge in this showdown between Baal, the god of the Canaanites, and Yahweh, the God of Israel, the one and only true God. Do it a second time, do it a third time, and they did it the third time. This idea of a third time, of a threefold exhortation to do something, is very significant in Scripture. And I think God is using that as a way of reminding the people of what the problem is. It's not just that you're lacking funds. It's not that you haven't done this work before. It's not just that 15 years later, maybe even the foundation of the temple that they laid is in a little bit of disrepair. The problem is not doing what you're supposed to do in light of your concerns about the circumstances you're surrounded in. And you may have legitimate perceptions about those circumstances. But that doesn't legitimize failure to obey and follow the Lord. In fact, interestingly enough, this threefold exhortation, take courage, Joshua, take courage, Zerubbabel, take courage, Joshua, take courage, all you people of the land, is followed by the verb, and it says, and work. The word there is, again, the word asah, which we talked about a few times. It just is a very general word, and do. No more excuses. You know what you need to do.